we can still let them in, so it's not a problem. So let me just start by welcoming all of you to the second panel in this semester's Teaching and Learning Center and Environmental Justice and Sustainability Program Open Conversation Series. It's great to see you and to see many people I have not yet met, which is one of the reasons for this series, for us to get connected with people we're not yet in conversation with. So this is really great. Thanks for being here. And also want to thank again Gina and the Teaching and Learning Center. And there is Kate and Ivana and Dirkle, who are hosting today's session, because Gina is out, even though she is listening in. And, thank them again for prompting this whole series by getting in touch with us at the end of last semester. And I'm really happy that we're doing this together this spring. And then I'd also like to thank, of course, Sandra, Gohar, and Guido for being here today for our panel on teaching environmental crime and wildlife crime. And I just want to say a few things to start us out, just to briefly say Sandra is here today, and Kate Good, who has also joined us, are currently co-coordinating the Environmental Justice and Sustainability Program. But I was the coordinator from 2014 until last spring, 2020. And so we started the program back in 2014. It was developed in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. And so we've had a close connection to environmental catastrophe from the very beginning, unfortunately. And I just wanted to say that when we started out, we developed two core courses for the program that we discussed in our last panel that are part of the general education program. And then there are 10 electives across, there are electives across 10 departments at the college. But we also developed one elective course that was a program course from the very beginning, and that's our environmental crime course, which is also offered by our program. And that program also counts in the majors in international criminal justice and in law and police science. And we developed that course as an elective because it was clear to us from the beginning that that intersection of environmental justice, sustainability, and crime was a particularly important one. And it was important for John Jay to make a contribution in that field. And so we were hoping from the beginning to broaden that curricular offering at the college. And program faculty back then also developed an MA course in environmental crime that's part of the MA program in criminal justice. And Gohar has since developed an undergraduate course in wildlife crime particularly. So the course offerings have been developing, and our hope for the panel series and this panel then in particular is, for all of you to develop ideas, starting points, inspiration, to maybe add units or assignments to your courses to spread the teaching of environmental and wildlife crime across the curriculum so we can reach the greatest number of students. I just want to briefly start out by showing you the resources that are already available on our program website. I hope you can all see this. Yeah. And I will put the URL in the chat in just a moment if you want to take a look. So there are a couple of things that are available to you on this page. There's a tag cloud in front. So one of the tags is environmental crime. You can explore that and you'll find entries on our program blog. Here's Gohar's book talk. So some of this is historical There are student posts here on our blog on various environmental crime issues. There are also faculty posts. So there are some things that you can find here pertinent to environmental crime. Then you might also want to take a look at the publications tab here, and you'll find both book publications. There's Goa's book, again, there are Jerry Markowitz's books, but there are also some articles here on environmental crime issues that are linked that you might just want to explore. And then finally, there's a web resources tab here that has general resources on environmental justice, sustainability, and some of them will, I'm sure, also be useful in teaching or thinking about environmental crime. So just wanted to point out these resources that the program has available to you already. And I'm going to put the URL in the chat in a moment. So you can explore those pages if you like. And then before I forget it at the end, I should also say, if you would like to be part of our program listserv, so you get information about events and discussions in the program, please send me an email and I'm happy to add you to the list, and I'll put my email in the chat in a second as well. So with that being said, without further ado, let's get started with our panel. So let me welcome our panelists again, and Sandra Swenson, as I said, now one of the co-coordinators of the program and also in the science program, will start us out. So Sandra, please, why don't you
share my screen? Yeah, thank you. You know, you mentioned Hurricane Sandy. I noticed right after that hurricane event, within the next semester, students at the college just totally became so much more aware of the environment and discussions in class, because it affected many of our students personally in many different ways. So yeah, I'm really proud of this minor, and I think that a lot of students are, it's been slow to catch on, but a lot of students are benefiting from the diversity of the courses that we teach, both in science, but also the arts and economics, and of course in the EJS program, in the criminal justice area as well. So it really is, the minor is an excellent program. Very proud of Alexander and Joan Hoffman for getting it off the ground. Okay, so I'll start. Let me share my screen. Here we are. I hope this works out okay. You can see my messy screen. Oh, not so much. I have it covered up. Okay, let's get started here with slideshow. Okay, so that introduction has already been made. The relevant courses for this topic that I'll be talking about today is the courses that we teach in our department: environmental science, focus on sustainability, ecology of the 5 boroughs. And there's a new course proposal that Christopher Herman and he's in criminal justice BS program. He and I are working on a new course proposal, GIS in New York City, mapping environmental crime. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I use data in all of my classes. I use raw data, student collected data, professionally collected data. Today, I'm just going to be focused on this new proposal, GIS in New York City. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about the integration of primary data into course curricula through the lens of intersectional environmentalism. So what I would like to do first, though, is give a background on terminology, because when discussing the environment, because there are a lot of terms that get thrown around, and I'd like to clarify some of the terms by contextualizing the terminology from a historical perspective. Traditionally, environmentalism has not included, and we're talking about like 30 years ago, has not included concerns about human welfare, but rather narrowly on the protection of natural systems and species. Environmentalists have not been especially interested in talking about human rights, preferring to talk about the rights of nature, for nature and animals. Additionally, environmentalists didn't consider urban communities an environment to be studied, like it didn't even exist, right? Neglecting to consider humans living in an urban community as a part of an ecosystem. So definitely this one course that we have is the ecology of the 5 boroughs. We look at exactly that, the ecology of an urban environment. It's a good course. So research was mainly focused on ecosystem services and biodiversity for economic viability. So therefore, what I would like to explore more is a holistic, deep environmental thought that concentrates on the integrity of all biotic and abiotic systems supporting human life along with other life forms. So what is environmental justice? According to the EPA, it is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So I'm going to swing back to that at the very last slide. And if we have time, we can talk more about that. And what is fair treatment? That's where no group of people should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, and commercial operations or policies. But of course, well before President Clinton signed the executive order, there were civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s recognizing environmental justice. And there were areas in the South that were experiencing environmental racism well before it actually became defined. For example, in Warren County, North Carolina, they became a dumping ground for PCB toxins in the soil. And some of you might be familiar with the GE factory in north on the Hudson that dredged a lot of their PCB toxins out of the Hudson River and had to find a place to dispose of them. And in fact, New York State was a dumping ground for Warren County, North Carolina. But it was in 1987 that Benjamin Chavis coined the phrase environmental racism after completing what was a United Church of Christ study, where he found that the proportion of minority members in communities with commercial hazardous waste facilities is double that of communities without such facilities. Where 2 or more such facilities are found, the proportion of minority members is nearly triple that in otherwise comparable communities. And in fact, the best predictor of where to find hazardous waste is to classify communities by race, not income, and not real estate values. So championed primarily by African Americans, Latinos, Asians, Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans, the environmental justice movement addresses a statistical fact. People who live, work, and play in America's most polluted environments are commonly people of color and the poor. Environmental justice advocates have shown that this is no accident. Communities of color, which are often poor, are routinely targeted to host facilities that have negative environmental impacts, say a landfill, a dirty industrial plant, or truck depot, to name a few. The statistics provide clear evidence of what the movement rightly calls environmental racism. Communities of colors have been battling this injustice for decades. So what does intersectionality have to do with this? The term intersectionality was first used by Kimberly Crenshaw, a scholar in critical race theory, in her 1989 paper entitled Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. In this paper, Crenshaw describes that anti-discrimination laws treat race and gender as mutually exclusive categories of experience and analysis. And consequently, for example, in cases where Black women have brought lawsuits against a company for both race and sex discrimination, courts have dismissed the cases on the basis that the plaintiffs have failed to cite any decisions where Black women are a special class to be protected from discrimination. And that her paper cites DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors. So as Crenshaw notes, Black women are theoretically erased and have no defense. The courts only recognize Black men in discriminatory race cases and white women in sex discrimination cases. Therefore, Crenshaw argues for intersectionality in her critical race theory, giving Black women an identity. And then just recently, I was reading the New York Times, Sunday Times, on February 28th, Michelle Goldberg had an opinion piece that noted there is a conservative movement right now to remove critical race theory training from government, originally proposed by the last president, the Orange Goblin, who ordered federal agencies to begin to identify all contracts or other agency spending related to any training on critical race theory, which was described as un-American propaganda. Now, noted, now the Biden administration is very different, right? So that will be carried out on the federal level, but I would argue that there are certainly many states that would still are addressing what they consider an un-American propaganda campaign, recognizing critical race theory. So the battle continues. So intersectional environmentalism and how it relates to environmental crime. So this is an inclusive version of environmentalism that advocates for both the protection of people and the planet. It identifies the ways in which injustices happening to marginalized communities and the earth are interconnected. So Leah Thomas used this phrase, intersectional, that was originally from Dr. Crenshaw. She's now using it to look at both people and the planet in terms of environmental causes. It brings injustices done to the most vulnerable communities and the earth to the forefront and does not minimize or silence social inequality. Intersectional environmentalism advocates for justice for people and the planet. Leah Thomas advocated for intersectional environmentalism following the murder of George Floyd and many other Black men and women who have been subject to racial discrimination leading to death. Leah called on the environmental community to make a pledge to Black lives and to commit to a journey of intersectional advocacy that would amplify silenced voices. Her post that from last summer, in May actually, went viral, and the online sustainability community began looking for spaces to listen to and amplify these silenced voices. So intersectional environmentalism, these are theoretical concepts that I would bring into my classroom, that I do bring into my classroom, and which leads to both environmentalists and environmental scientists alike need to encourage more citizens to be involved with what is happening in their community. One important way to do this is by collecting data and disseminating it through maps. So this is our new course proposal. In the new course proposal that Christopher Herman and I are designing, students will collect data using GIS, Esri GIS data, open source data, and they will layer the data into maps so that people in their specific communities in and around New York City, that's our target group, the 5 boroughs, will be able to see where they might be affected by polluted air, water, and soil, as well as other health issues and also climate change vulnerability. So these are some of the links that we would be using. There's the Department of Environmental Conservation, GIS itself, Geographic Information Systems. The DEC actually has a lot of GIS data. New York City open data sources, Esri location data, looking at census data, looking at demographic data and layering that with various components of environmental crime. There's also GIS and my.gov, all freely accessible. But the college itself has programs available for courses and for students for free. Normally, the Esri GIS program is quite expensive. How are we doing for time, Alexander?
You're about at the 10-minute mark now, so.
Okay, I thought I might be. So I'll just show that this is an example of a report, a professional report, but we would ask our students to pull together maps such as this. This shows traffic density with monitoring locations, and then they can layer data, whatever they're looking at. This is particulate matter. This is an example. This is professionally done, but still students, their images would come out pretty close to this, I think. These are oxides in the environment, and then sulfur in the environment. So this is mapping data specific to New York City. And then finally, I just want to end by saying that, we're all trying to get our students to make personal choices that may help them make better energy choices, getting involved in community projects, political activism, making sure all voices are heard. And then the most problematic and frustrating thing for me is, we have this executive order for environmental justice that was signed. It is a law, but, implementing and enforcing environmental laws, regulations, and policies have proven to be very problematic. So that's where the hard work really is. And that's good we're in a college of criminal justice. We can address these things. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Sandra. Do you mind if you can just stop screen sharing, then I can.
Of course. Sorry.
The rest. No, that's fine. Don't worry.
Okay.
That makes it easier for me to see the group, because I think we have. I think we'll have a few minutes for questions now for Sandra. I'd like to just have a short segment of questions right after the presentation, and then we'll have time in the end for general discussion. So if anybody has a question now for Sandra, please there's few of us, so you can just raise your hands on screen or use your electronic hands if you prefer, or just ask away.
I guess no questions might be good questions. Has anyone tried using raw data in their classrooms to show trends with particular things they're looking at? It doesn't have to be just in the sciences, of course. It can be any discipline. Does anybody bring raw data right into their classroom and have students manipulate it? That's a great skill for students to learn while they're in undergraduate college. I advocate for that.
There's Paul.
Yeah, so yes, I do. Obviously, it's not a coincidence, but I do it in my straight economics data course. And trends are something they understand. So you put economic trends with CO2 trends and things like that. And it's a way to open things up. And I also, when I teach statistics, sometimes I have them forecast global warming using ice core data, using the same financial econometrics they use to forecast economic parameters. So then they go, oh, because they're using that to plan the economy, and it shows the same thing. So,
so where do you get your ice core data from?
There's the Vostok ice core.
Oh, sure,
and,
sure. Yeah.
And then actually, my students went out and found a new data set, and on their own did that once. So yeah, the students can be enterprising. They were trying to do public water data, which was harder for them. But actually, I think that's another interesting area. I think Environmental Working Group has a water tool of water quality. But I really like what you're doing with the mapping. I think we should be using mapping software more often.
Yeah.
At John Jay.
There's a big learning curve with it, though, and yeah. So, but we're going to try to get more students on board. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm curious, and just before we move on to Guido, I'm just curious from what you've outlined, are you then in the course also planning to see if the mapping you do has to do with potentially illegal pollution in the city? And if yes, how would you map those connections so they become enforceable or can drive policy? Or I'm just curious.
Well, to become enforceable and drive policy is a whole different question. I think it's like a big, like that's a career thing. But yeah, I mean, I think what we would ask is our students to write a report that could potentially be used to shape public policy. And so they would have to come up, of course, with the arguments, looking at the data and also looking at marginalized communities and talking about how, in fact, having air pollution, the nitrogen or sulfur levels of way over the normal average is a crime. They'd have to build that into their argument. That's not easy to do. I mean, teaching environmental science, one of the things that we teach is that it's really hard to make correlations between the environment and what might be happening in terms of health problems in a community, because it's really hard to make correlations because the environment has so many variables. So getting citizens involved in citizen science, which is it's always really valuable, really helpful, people collecting data in their neighborhoods, and then bring it into a central location to be put into a database is one good way to begin that awareness.
Great. Thanks so much, Sandra.
Thank you.
Helen
I'll
has
put up some links.
Helen, I think we have time for one more quick question. So Helen, I see your hand up, so please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. So it's really big, like from my curiosity, I was just wanted to ask, how many number of annual reports are being reported that is related to environmental racism or intersectionality?
So very few right now, I think, on intersectionality. Environmental racism, there's quite a bit. And in fact, our library itself has a lot of resources and papers. So you can go right to our library and do some research there. There's a lot of books out. There's one I'm reading right now. I just saw her talk by Julie Alexander. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Julie Says, S-Z-E.
I think it's Z, but I'm not
sure. Julie Z. It's called Noxious New York, and it was published in 2007 by MIT Press. So her name is Julie S-Z-E. It was actually her doctoral thesis paper. It blew me away. She discusses 4 case studies of environmental racism and also environmental activism. She looks at it historically, but also up until 2007. So did that help answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Oh, Christopher Herman, hi.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Christopher, I think we're going to need to hold your question until the larger discussion at the end, because I just want to give Guido and Gohar a chance to present, but please hold your thought. I just noted your question and we'll come back to that at the end. Is that okay?
Of course, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Christopher. So I would say let's continue with Guido, who is currently teaching the environmental crime course in our program. He's a graduate of the MA program in criminal justice here from John Jay. So we're quite happy about those connections. And he also works in environmental management. And so Guido, I'm looking forward to your presentation. Please share your thoughts with us.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you, Alexander. It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you, of course, Gina, Alexander, and it's great to share the panel with Sandra and Gohar, all persons that I have the luck to work with. So for those of you who don't know me, a little bit of a self-presentation. My name is Guido Giordano. I am originally from Argentina. I'm Argentinian American, and I'm actually in Argentina right now. So as for my academic background, and I'm saying this because it pertains or it relates to what I want to say after in the presentation. I graduated as a lawyer here in Argentina. I studied then environmental management. I needed to get away from the law discourse and get back to some hard science. And then I went to New York City and did the MA in criminal justice. And there I focused, well, John Jay has, I would say, a bigger focus in public policies and in sociology than in criminal law itself, although criminal law is, of course, present in the MA. So after that, after those stages of my life, I started teaching EJS 240, which is environmental crime. And I would say that one big challenge for this course is that it is actually, as many of our courses in the program, really interdisciplinary. And the big challenge is that one gets students from very, very diverse backgrounds. And I mean, of course, racial, ethnicity, and nationality backgrounds, but I mean academic backgrounds. To all the others, we're more used at John Jay because we are probably a diverse college. But the thing is, when you have to teach environmental crime to kids that are studying toxicology and others that are studying, for example, anthropology, well, there's the challenge of setting common grounds. So I wanted to focus a little bit on that because I believe that the first weeks of the course really set the mark on where the course goes in general. So for any of you, for any of those who are interested in this field, what I would say is that the first, or the way I do it, how I outline the course, the first weeks should definitely be introductory. The course itself is, well, of course, as the name says it, environmental crime. So you need to have lots of information about the environment and information about crime. So what I do usually, I start with the environment and use 1 week probably to treat only the environment and its components. Those students that come from hard sciences, from biology or from toxicology or from forensic sciences, they are more used perhaps to some of these contents. But those that are studying criminal justice or criminology are definitely not. And then for the following week, I try to treat the topic of crime in general as a phenomenon. And crime itself, it's a complex phenomenon. So I try to address it from at least two perspectives at that point, which is the sociological point of view, where we at John Jay are really familiarized with, really used of it, and then the legal point of view, which I think it's probably my greatest input in the course. And the way I do it, I usually outline Blackboard discussions, and I have students interact among each other. And I encourage them to talk with different persons every week. And I also like to encourage them to talk to those that are not necessarily peers who they agree with. Of course, there's always an academic way of disagreeing properly. But the idea is that they are confronted with these diverse backgrounds, and that they actually get enriched by this particularity of this course and of our program in general. So when I start with the environment, of course, those are no more of as I said, hard sciences. There's always the risk of them being a little bit bored because that may seem basic for them. But they have to keep in mind that many of their peers are really not familiarized at all with concepts as ecosystem or biodiversity, and are necessary, completely necessary to better understand the whole course. And then the opposite happens on the following weeks when we treat crime. Of course, one doesn't want any student to be bored, but I will have to say, I prefer running the risk of giving some content that may seem basic for them than running the risk of taking for granted that they know something and then finding out on week 8 or at the middle of the course that they don't. So for the first week, it may seem like a slow pace for some, but I think it's worth, as long as the design of the course allows it and the group goes with it, it's better and it's worth to do it that way. And then for the phenomenon of crime itself, it is also a complex phenomenon in itself. So there's the sociological point of view and then the legal point of view. And I usually use, even though it may seem basic, the Bill of Rights. I go, because what happens often is that luckily our students, most of them are really enthusiastic about the contents of what we're doing and what we're studying. And that enthusiasm can often lead to them saying, okay, this person that threw a paper on the streets deserves life without parole, for real. That, like, those reactions may happen. So one really has to take care about the legal approach and having them know that what is exactly a crime as per our legal system. What is a criminal procedure? What is the proper way of providing criminal justice to citizens, guaranteeing their right to be considered innocent until proven the opposite, for example, and having them, in the case that they are found guilty, given a proportionate punishment. So those are things that I always try to take care in the course and to always be looking for them, because students may too rapidly provide answers for specific cases that are not or may not be suited for actually a democratic republic, and that happens. So I would say my advice is one always has to take care with about that. And then I use the public policy approach on the final weeks of the course. So the middle of the course is basically addressing the intersection of the environment and crime, which is environmental crime, first as a general topic, and after that, I go into the specific types of offenses. For example, pollution of the air, the ground, the waters. Wildlife crime, of course, has a place there, and many different types of offenses. And then after that, what I try to do for them is for them to think about how to approach this phenomenon. Approaching means either preventing them throughout general public policies and responding to them to specific cases. And that's usually the hardest or the most challenging part, because it is not easy, and especially with environmental crimes, whose effects are so diffuse and oftentimes cross borders. So it is definitely not easy, as Sandra said before, to spot the crime and to link such crime to a human conduct that we have to decide about. So that's, how are we doing on time, Alexander? I'm sorry.
You're about at the 10-minute mark right now, Guido, so.
Okay, great. So I'll round it up. But that was basically what I wanted to talk about. I think that environmental crime is an incredible field. It is too diverse, and one has to always remember that we are working with students that have really, really diverse academic backgrounds. So the first weeks, I would say, they are necessary to set common grounds. Then you can go into the topic itself of environmental crime and into each offense. And then after that, you can have them build these approaches or responses to this phenomenon, which is basically or one of the main goals of this course. Have them critically think, and have them prepared for whatever they want to do after the course professionally. Okay, I hope that was clear enough and useful, of course. And if anyone has any question, I'm here.
Yes, many thanks, Guido. And yes, please, there's two for Guido's presentation, a few minutes for questions. So if anybody would like to ask something, please do. Sandra?
So Guido, thank you. Can you give us some specific examples of the crime, the cases that you do look at? Just a couple, maybe?
Yes, I can, of course. And I have the syllabus right here with me. For example, throughout weeks, well, take a common course, right? A 15-week course. Throughout weeks 5 to week 10 or 11, depending on spring or fall, I first focus on pollution, and I use pollution on ground, water, and air. For example, the Bhopal tragedy in India for polluting the air. I don't know if anyone is familiarized with that. Okay, and then the Love Canal tragedy.
Yeah.
Right there in New York State. Those, for example. Then I go into wildlife crime, which, well, the course has a lot of wildlife crime. I really like wildlife crime, and I focus on that, but I try not to focus too much because it may take a lot from other crimes. And then also I try to focus or provide some insights, at least, on some topics about environmental justice that may not be specifically related to a crime. For example, access to water. That's a week where I usually provide that information, and it may not be a specific crime, but we have to understand that crimes are a part of a broader aspect, which is justice, social environmental justice. And then also I've added to the fact of crimes against animals, the issue of domestic animal abuse, which is also a topic that, and Sandra, as you said, oftentimes environmentalism has thought of animal rights and nature's rights, but we have tended to leave humans aside, and that also happened with domestic animal abuse. We are more used to reading about wildlife crime than domestic animal abuse, and of course, these conducts, everyone is outraged by them, but we are not sure about how to address them because they take place in an intimate environment, which is the house. So those are, for example, some of the topics. And I've also added recently information about geocide or ecocide, which is a crime against nature broadly. And a lot has been written for the past probably 25 or 30 years, but not much has been achieved in that area. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. Very specific, very helpful. Thank you.
And I just see, Paul, you posted a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to ask it yourself. We may have time for one more question before we come to Gohar.
Yeah, I cannot see the chat right now.
Yeah,
I can just say it. A couple things. Have you found good videos for students on environmental crime? And then also, what kind of assignments do you give them besides discussion board? Do you use case studies, or what kind of activities do you have them do?
Well, as far as videos, there are good ones. One that I found and that I find really interesting. Many of our students, at least my students in this course, are inclined to or are already into the law enforcement agency or are inclined to be at one. So I found one about New York State's environmental police, and that's a good video. I can give you the link later, but that's interesting for them because they really see what kind of work they may be doing later, which is one thing that I like the course. I think that the courses should be linked to professional, to whatever they will do professionally after. So that's one thing. And then regarding the assignments, Blackboard comments are due every week. They are they have to interact. They have to produce their own content and then interact with a peer. Of course, it happens that they sometimes give too general answers. I really like your comment. You have to encourage them to go deeper. And then I also provide quizzes and a final paper. And in that final paper, the idea is to integrate all the knowledge that they have acquired or should have acquired throughout the whole course, which is identify a crime and say why it is a crime. I also have them think about how some environmental problems are actually not environmental crimes and require a different answer than that of the criminal justice system. So identify an environmental problem and environmental crime at the same time, say why it is a crime. And then say, suppose that you have to prevent crimes like this. What would you do as a general public policy? And then suppose that you are, for example, the judge of such crime. What specific response you would give to that specific conduct? So that's basically the final paper where they should go through the whole course. And of course, of the whole catalog of crimes, they will choose, I give them freedom in that sense, whichever offense they find most interesting.
Great.
Is
Thanks,
that
Guido.
clear?
Yeah, and I think we're now right at the point where we should turn to Gohar for our general time. So thanks, Guido, for your presentation. And Gohar, I'm really glad you're here to close us out. And I should just quickly say that Gohar directs the MA program in International Crime and Justice, and has also been a member of the program for many years now. So please, Gohar.
Hi, everyone. I really love how this presentation's unfolded. We started from a very general, and now my presentation is going to be actually very specific on an assignment that I have designed to teach a class. So I think this blended into the topics blended in really well. So the class I really wanted to talk about today was the class I taught last fall, under the unusual circumstances of the teaching in our college. And the course was called Wildlife Crime Issues and Prevention. So even though I had the opportunity, and I think many of us did, to teach the class asynchronously, I thought it would be a good idea to have some kind of synchronous interaction with the students. So I chose the synchronous version of the class, which meant I met with them via Zoom weekly, and we discussed the course materials and so forth. However, it was in a sense kind of designed as a hybrid course because the main platform and the tools that I used to teach the students was Blackboard. I know Judy will be happy to hear this. And I took full advantage of the resources that Blackboard had to offer me to run and organize the course and guide the students throughout the semester. Unlike the other courses that we discussed today, this particular course was focused on who took this class, or who the CJPA open their horizon, so that to show them that the skills and all the learning that they have done throughout their 3 years at John Jay can easily be transferable to teaching, to applying their prevention skills, the crime prevention, crime analysis skills to the prevention of wildlife crimes. So the structure of each week was, I used the most wonderful alignment table organization that I have learned from the John Jay online teaching class, which involved really which helped me really organize the weeks so that and guide the students throughout. So each week that I had on Blackboard had very clearly outlined structures. Started with an overview, which provided the students with a paragraph description of what they were supposed to learn that week, what was the focus of the topics for that week, and then very specific learning objectives, and then assigned readings designed to meet those learning objectives. Each week had a video, a YouTube video primarily, or videos from other sources in National Geographic and so forth that were not on YouTube, but in other websites that I was able to incorporate into Blackboard and have them watch. And of course, they had discussion forums. In fact, every week they had 2 discussion forums, the ones that related to their learnings and the application of their learnings to some kind of specific discussion question. And another one was their interpretation and what they have learned about the videos, about the crime, that they watched about in the video, and how they can use some of their crime prevention skills and training to address that particular crime. And then every other week or so, they had written assignments, which is something that I'm going to be talking about more extensively. And occasionally they had guest speakers. I think this was a great experience for them because they got to listen not only to me, but other people, mainly other scholars who do research in the field, as well as practitioners from various, non-governmental organizations, the Environmental Protection Agency, and so forth. So I really wanted them to have that kind of background, to people. Assignment assigned to pretty much capitalize on the students' strengths. And the reason I know what their strengths are had been a So for the assignment, for the course, they had individual assignments and group assignments. So the group assignments were meant to be only 20 to 25 pages, and it involved 4 or 5 students in the group. But one of the groups ended up writing a 39-page guide, and I'll talk about those guides on human-elephant conflict. And I could not have felt prouder than seeing them so much effort and ambition put into producing this exemplary work. And I think part of the reason why they were so motivated, and they didn't even realize that in the end they produced the 39-page document that was just the group assignment, they still had to handle another 15-page one separately, was because of the scaffolding that I used throughout the semester. So every other week or so, or sometimes it meant every week as well, right? In some weeks, some months, they had to submit only 3-page progress reports to me, and in the scope of things, right? Those don't really look a lot. Oh, it's only 3 pages I can handle, but those 3 pages turned into 39 pages at the end. And I think this was the tricky terminology I used. It's just a progress report. And indeed it was, because all they were supposed to do is provide me with a progress that they're making in writing their assignment. And each progress report was very specific to what they were supposed to do in the report. And I think giving some specificity to the students in what exactly is expected of them to doing the assignment gave them a better sense of direction as to what was expected of them and how they should go about kind of tackling those assignments. The progress reports then culminated into a final report, which was this 15-page paper. But I think submitting the progress reports throughout the semester also gave them the opportunity to take the feedback from me and then incorporate the changes and improve on their final paper as they put the final paper together. So each of those reports was actually part of the final report, which incorporated just one additional section. And then everything else was really pulling those progress reports together, the revisions. And they had to, every time they had the progress report, they also had to present it for 5 minutes, and the presentations were made on VoiceThread. So we didn't use class time, right, to have the students present those. This was one of the greatest advantages of having Blackboard. We didn't use the class time for those particular presentations, but the students still had, every single one of them still had an opportunity to present their work to their classmates and then get feedback from them, right? And still, have the time to do other things in class with me and learn. The presentations were also on the final reports. Similarly, for the group assignments, they had, for them to work, it's a little bit tricky. So I had them write a contract that they came up with, all the conditions of the contract and what they will be doing and what each member's responsibility and what will they punish, right? In a sense, right? They're violators of the contractual responsibilities. So I was really a facilitator there. I was not the one who drafted the contract and gave it to them, and they had to comply by this, but they were free to design their own contract which meant their group contributions, each member's responsibilities, and so on and so forth. And they all signed. And this group contract makes miracles. They all, once they agree to what they are going to do, they pretty much stick with it because they came up with those conditions themselves. Then they had a group leader who submitted the group assignments. And I think one thing I tried, which was absolutely new, I have never tried this before, was to use the Google Docs as a working space for all the students in the group to work on that group assignment simultaneously. I also received access to that Google Docs, so my comments and feedback were also, in a sense, kind of real time. And I tried to give them as timely as possible to give them the time to improve on their work. And of course, in the end, they all had to do a presentation. So this is an example of a problem-specific guide, one of the problem-specific guide draft. So this is what they were supposed to do. And this whole thing was supposed to be just about 20-25 pages, but the human elephant conflict kiddos ended up doing a 39-page one, which was very cool. So one other thing that I wanted to bring to your attention is some of you may be familiar with the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing, which is a place where all sorts of problem-oriented policing guides are available on conventional crime problems. And very recently, the wilderness problems tab was added to that center, which specifically focuses on providing resources on all wildlife crime related issues. And so for example, we have the problem-oriented wildlife protection guide. We have the poaching diaries, which is a very cool way of applying crime scripting to understanding crime from beginning to the end, and the problem-specific guides. And so the group assignments that I gave the students for that class and were for them to actually create a problem-specific guide that was later, that is now actually currently being edited to be posted on this website. So that makes me profoundly proud of them having not only learned from this experience, but also have eventually contributing to the production of knowledge. So they became the producers, initially consumers, but then producers of knowledge. Alexander, how much time do I have?
You are also pretty much out of time, Gohar. So if you can.
Okay, I have one last, so, and this is how it works. The progress report guide looks like. So this is part 2 of the report, and each report had very specific purpose. So what they were expected to do in that report, and then what the guidelines for that report are, and what the presentation guidelines that were, and how they were supposed to submit their presentations. So I cannot speak enough about the miracle of scaffolding. It works perfectly. If there are any larger assignments, consider breaking them down into pieces, because I think that makes students less anxious about those assignments, but in the end, they end up producing really cool work. And of course, other things, specific guidelines that are provided so they know exactly what to do, timely feedback, of course, and a combination of various tools that help them achieve their goals and enhance their learning. That's it from my end.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Gohar. So here too, we have, it's now 2:45, so we have 10 minutes left. So maybe we should just start with like specific questions for Gohar, and then we have a little bit of time for wider discussion of the whole panel. So if anybody has a direct question for Gohar, please go ahead and ask.
Okay, me again. I would like to know again, Gohar, some specific examples of the areas on a global level that your students are investigating, and excuse me, how do they get the global information? I mean, I'm sure there's probably journals, but still. Excuse me.
Well, I use a mix of a combination of resources. So I primarily rely on empirical research on the topics. So the course itself was divided into really 3 main sections. So the first section was the overall overview about wildlife crime problems, specifically wildlife trafficking, poaching, etc. Then the second part of the course was a series of case studies, and those case studies were divided into wild flora and wild fauna, right? So we had some wild flora cases and then wild fauna cases. And then the last section was going back to the crime prevention theories, and then the actual application of, okay, so this is the theory and we know you learned it in this context. Let's try to figure out how to apply this theory to a wildlife crime problem. So I would give them, so for example, the poaching diaries that I mentioned there, right, uses the technique of crime scripting, which is just a method of understanding the beginning to the end. And what I had the students do is they had to pick a crime problem that they felt most passionate about, or something that we had already learned about in class, and then think like a criminal, you know, how would a criminal go about committing this particular crime, right? And then the whole purpose of that was, once they know how it's committed, what it's needed, you know, the precondition of committing the crime and the post condition and so on and so forth, they would then be able to identify the anchor points of intervention. And that was the whole point of them thinking about prevention once they know how the crime is committed. So I tried to give them a lot of the different crimes. There were lots of case studies. I tried to stick to both the common known wildlife trafficking, you know, the rhinos and tigers and elephants and so forth, but also the less known ones as well, right? You know, songbirds, you know, eaten for as delicacy, or I don't know, swiftlets and so on and so forth. So I gave them a whole range, but they each also were required to do a paper on a species, whether it's a plant or an animal, that is not being covered in class. So that was the challenge. They had to go through the entire, you know, syllabus to see what species we will be covering throughout the semester and choose one that they were not, because I wanted them also to educate themselves and their peers on other topics that I would not have otherwise had a chance to cover.
Nice touch. Yeah. What plants, what Flora, do they?
So cactus, we had the cacti. We had of course, the orchids. I had one student who did the presentation on the lady slipper orchid. What else did we do? The pitcher plant, the Indian pitcher plant.
Oh, sure.
We had. So there are a few case studies. Unfortunately, there aren't as many planned case study examples as there are online, of course. But also we did the medicinal plants separately, like any medicinal plant, right? A conglomerate of medicinal plants, and then the decorative plants, right? Aquariums and so on and so forth. So, so they had some exposure to the material, but they were also left to their own. What is it? What's the word I'm looking for? So they were left to think freely and figure out ways of, preventing those crimes and especially those that they were interested in. There were assignments where to study the crime that they wanted to study, but also design, most importantly, design prevention strategies to address that particular crime.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, Gore. There are two things. One, Paul just posted in the chat whether some of your students might be interested in writing up blog posts for our program website. The projects sound great. So just putting this out there from my end too as a suggestion. We have actually a public engagement tool on our website. So if students want to post blog posts and do some public writing, we have that opportunity. And the other thing, the other thing, because we are running low on time, and I don't want to, overlook Christopher's earlier post on the chat about, there was a long discussion in the chat about GIS training being available in courses for students, but that also raises the larger question that has sort of come up in all your presentations, and that is questions on how we might be able in some way to, if you want, scaffold a transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary teaching at the college with the various questions that arise that Guido also pointed out in, what kind of backgrounds do students have? And so I guess I wanted to both ask, first, Christopher, if the chat produced enough information about GIS courses, or if we should discuss those further. And then in relation to that, what other issues might be that the panelists or others see that we might be able to link across the curriculum to improve sort of a common background around these issues. So I'm just opening this up. Christopher, I don't know if you want to start and say something about your question.
Yeah, no, Maggie was very helpful in highlighting some of the courses that are available to undergrads. But again, it would be nice if we had like a gen ed option for students just to take an intro to GIS class, just so they could just kind of familiarize themselves with the software and some of the more popular data sets. Because, if students came into another undergrad class with something, with a little GIS under their belts, it would just make teaching the course a lot easier for faculty. But I also think that, we could obviously do a lot more with students if they just had a little bit of exposure experience in that 100, 200 level. Yeah,
that of course raises the problem of course prerequisites and how you might structure that and what is required for your students to take the classes. Otherwise, you'll have two different groups of students, some that have taken the course and others that don't. So I'm not quite sure how that would be best solved concretely for the course. Maggie, do you know if if this would be an option for any department at the college to offer a gen ed course in that field?
I guess so there are two things that I wanted to add to this. I don't know I'm not aware of the administrative rules. There are these 2 undergrad courses that have been taught for a long time in law and police science without difficulty because we had lab access. But now, this just in the last 2 months, DeWitt and Joe have provided access to lab PCs remotely for all students. That process is through the John Jay VPN. So when you think about how your students will use ArcGIS, it is true that ArcGIS will send us as many free codes as we want. I get 100 a year, you could get 500 a year. You can give them the software, but it has to be installed in a PC, doesn't work in Macs. ArcGIS on the cloud is clunky and difficult for students with Macs, but signing in via the VPN to a John Jay computer and doing work there and being able to save it in the T drive and come back and work on it means that your students really don't need lab access to be able to work practically with ArcGIS. So that was sort of, I was going to put this in a message later, but I don't know, we didn't have any difficulty getting the 2 courses through. I don't understand. I didn't really understand your question, Alexandra, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that these were existing gen ed courses. So this was, I was just following up on Christopher's suggestion that there might be a general education course for students. But you're right, Megan, maybe this is better, you know, for a separate concrete discussion that you might have with Christopher and Sandra on planning. Because I see that we're coming up on 2:55. So I just want to thank all our panelists again for a very informative panel, ranging from Sandra's broad introduction to Guido's and course description and Gora's assignment scaffolding. And I think putting all this together will be very helpful information. I'm glad all this is being recorded. So eventually all this will be accessible on the Teaching and Learning Center pages for other faculty to access. So thanks again for your presentation, and thanks everybody for coming and your questions and discussion. I really appreciate it.
And thank